What does an expert on death and dying want to tell people when she finds out that she's facing her own death?
I don't know, Debra. None of it has been a surprise to me. I don't know what to tell them. I don't know. Well, I don't think we know. I think it's a big mystery because it's ridiculous. But I don't care. Honestly, I don't know, Debra. I'll think about that. No, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think about that. That's a fact.
You're listening to The Final Say, Conversations with People Facing Death. I'm Debra Jarvis, and The Final Say is the podcast where you can get comfortable talking about death and learn some things about life from people who are facing death. My guest today is Trudy James, an interfaith hospital chaplain, AIDS worker, and Death with Dignity pioneer, and a close friend of mine for over 30 years. A couple of months before this interview with her, she was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive endometrial cancer. She is 86, and there is no treatment available that she's interested in doing, and they give her 3 to 4 months to live. Of course, I asked her to be on this podcast. I mean, a death and dying expert, an articulate, intelligent, dynamic speaker. And so she agreed to be interviewed, but I have to be honest with you and say that even then, when she agreed, she did not sound overly enthusiastic. And in fact, she changed the date of our interview meeting 3 times. So I had some really big clues that this might not go well. Now, I have a lot to say in this episode because I learned a lot of hard, sad things about how pain medication addles the mind, about how interviewing a close friend who is facing death is really, really hard, and how in almost any situation, you'll have a richer experience if you focus on giving than if you focus on getting. I can see that the pain medication is leaving her short on words.
I had lots of pain meds last week.
Yeah.
And they boggled my brain. They boondoggled my brain. But I woke up this morning with no pain whatsoever. First time. It was wonderful.
That's
and
fantastic.
That's because I have a very smart daughter working with a very wonderful hospice nurse, and they're working it out.
Good. And now a little background. I first met Trudy when she moved to Seattle over 30 years ago. She had been using my book, The Journey Through AIDS, in her AIDS work in Arkansas. Well, I'll just let her tell the story.
I looked and looked and looked for a book to give the care teams to read, and I couldn't find one that worked. And I finally found your book, and I thought, this is the best I've seen. I'm going to get this for the care teams. And I went to the bookstore, and of course, they weren't ordering it anymore. And then I moved out here, and I thought, I can meet Debra, who wrote that book. And I called you up and said, could we get together? And you said, could you come for lunch? We've been getting together ever since.
Yeah, we instantly became close friends. And we worked together in the AIDS community. We celebrated birthdays together. We produced benefit concerts for AIDS nonprofits. And we took weekly walks around Green Lake where we talked incessantly about helping our culture get comfortable talking about death and dying. Trudy also gave end-of-life workshops, and she produced a documentary about these workshops called Speaking of Dying. Now, they say that if an interview is good, it's because of the guest. If the interview is bad, it's because of the host. And in this case, that was exactly true. First of all, I totally failed to be professional. I didn't say her name, the date, or where we were recording. And usually I'm quite intuitive and pick up on body language immediately. But at the time, I didn't pick up that she was sitting with her arms crossed and her knees pressed together. And I didn't hear in her voice that she was annoyed.
What's the question?
You would think that after hearing her say, "I don't know," to several juicy questions, I would stop. But instead, I blundered on.
How has all the work you've done all these years around death and dying affected how you're dealing with your own death now?
That makes it a lot easier. I know all the
Because-
questions. I know what is happening. I've planned for everything, discussed it many times. Simple for me. I don't know, Debra. None of it has been a surprise to me.
Yeah.
It just hasn't.
I asked her how people could be authentic in their responses, be really honest about their grief when they're talking to a terminally ill person. How could they express themselves without then making that person take care of them? What did she think about that?
I don't think about that. That's a fact.
I tried reframing the question.
So I guess my question...
What's the question?
So the question is, how can somebody who's got a terminal diagnosis share the news with somebody and keep their reactions real without people suppressing their emotions and pretending everything is okay?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Still, I pressed her.
What's been your experience so far of people reacting to your news?
People react the way I react. So if I'm all upset, they'd be upset, but I'm not, and I haven't been. So
Okay.
they haven't been.
Okay.
So people haven't been upset. People have been supportive and sad. I think they're sad. I think my children at first were quite sad, but because I've done this work for a long time and they've heard me say over and over that I don't want to live with an illness, I don't like being sick. I worked, I gathered signatures to get death with dignity on the ballot. I believe in death with dignity. They really, my children did well. They didn't get terribly upset,
Somebody who's listening to this podcast maybe doesn't know anything about death and dying, and they're scared. And you've been doing this work for years and years and years.
Yeah, I can't tell them how to go back and do it. I can't. No. And I can't be different than I am. So I don't know what to tell them. I don't.
I guess you could tell them, don't be afraid to talk about it.
Oh.
Yikes. Did you hear that scoff? And there I am telling my guest how I want her to answer. Now, even though Trudy was a pioneer in death with dignity and death and dying, it didn't occur to me that at this point she was done educating people. Now she was occupied with what else? Facing her own death. But I continued to press her, and worst of all, I cried.
I can't even think about walking around Green Lake without you.
Yeah.
And I
That's
hesitate to share things like that with you because I think, oh, this is that question that I started with, that I don't want you to feel bad, that I feel bad. It's the ping pong suffering, you know?
You don't need to worry about me.
No, I don't worry about you. I kind of more worry about myself. Like, there's no one else in my life like you.
I don't know what to say to that, Debra. I've thought about that because probably 10 different people have said that to me in the last 2 days. People say that to me.
Yeah.
I don't have anyone else like you in my life. No one who can listen to me and take it all in.
Let me stop here and say that her answer dried up my tears immediately. There's nothing like finding out you're not special, that you're in line like so many other fans mourning her upcoming death. Nothing like that to completely shut down your grief, and I felt myself snap shut.
Well, I just had a woman write to me yesterday and say, "You're just part of my being," and I don't even feel that I know her that well. And I don't know how I can live without you because you're part of my being.
Well, God, I'm not going to put that on you. I will live without you. I'm just bummed about it, but
I don't know what it is, though.
I'm going to stop torturing you now with how badly I handled this. Instead, I'm going to give you Trudy at her finest. 8 years ago, Naseema Sefi and I interviewed Trudy for our podcast, The Art of Risk. Trudy talked about death and dying and taking risks, so I'm going to share with you a clip from episode 3 of The Art of Risk. Trudy, welcome to The Art of Risk.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Trudy, we're so happy to have you. You're an expert at living deeply and dying well and have studied the spiritual issues around that journey as an interfaith chaplain. Where did it all start? How did you become so comfortable with risky conversations?
Where did it all start? Sometimes I say it started with my AIDS work because it was so risky to talk about AIDS in the 80s and such a fearful subject to everyone. And my job was to do AIDS education in the churches in Arkansas, which were hysterical about AIDS and fearful, and also then to recruit and train volunteers to be on teams to take care of people with AIDS. And in doing that, they had to listen to young people talk about their own death, and my job was to help them get comfortable with that. So really, that's where the seeds come from for the work I do now. I'm relatively fearless. I would have to say that.
I'm wondering if it felt fearful to you at the time to broach the subject of death and dying, whether in the AIDS patients or later on when you're doing this kind of end-of-life planning with people who are actually afraid of confronting their own death.
That's a good question because it always feels risky. I just had a good friend lost his partner this weekend, and I visited them last week. And to bring up the subject of death to people because of the way our culture feels about it always feels intrusive, always feels risky. And on the other hand, if you don't bring it up, people don't know that it's safe to talk to you about it. So I've done maybe 60 of these end-of-life planning groups now. In the beginning, it always feels slightly risky. These are all people that are vulnerable and all fearful of talking about death. And so to begin it feels risky. And I've done it often enough that I know that they're going to be very thankful that they did it, and they're going to share wonderful stories. It's all going to be good. It still feels risky because the culture is so death averse and so fearful.
Do you open them up by sharing and self-disclosing about your own attitude toward death?
By telling my own stories, yeah. And then asking them immediately to begin telling theirs, which they are glad to do because they've not had a chance to share them other places. And once they find out it's a safe place, they love it.
Are your children comfortable having a conversation with you about your future
I think
death?
they're tired of it. They say, "Do we have to talk about that again?" I'm afraid I've worn them out on planning for my death. They know very clearly what I want and don't want.
Can they talk about planning for their own deaths?
No. No, they're normal people. Normal people in our culture don't want to talk about it unless you really get them in a setting.
Yeah.
Or they're facing it. But I like to get people upstream before they're facing a terminal illness and get them comfortable then talking about it and planning and hopefully talking to their family members. But they often come back and say, my kids don't want to talk or my parents don't want to talk. And that's one reason I made the film, Speaking of Dying, was that then they can watch this film together, which then they can talk about the people in the film. And it slowly makes it possible. It's sort of ridiculous how we've gotten in this place in our culture, just where it's not a comfortable subject for anybody, really.
I have to self-disclose and share that before I was ready to have a child, I had to write a book about the death of a child and go through that emotional journey, at least empathically and imaginatively, and doing research with those who had
Good
lost
for you.
children.
That's what I want to say. My very first child died at 4 days old.
Oh, wow.
And so I wasn't prepared at all. And I dealt with it the way our culture deals with it. I just pulled myself up and didn't cry and went on with my role as the minister's wife. And it took me years then to really fully get over that.
When do you think you finally dealt with that? What was it that
When
finally...
I became a hospital chaplain,
Yeah.
and my supervisor said, "You're not visiting the patients who've lost a baby." That's how it was lying within me.
Wow.
Grief, if you don't deal with it, will just stay with you.
It will.
Yeah.
It festers like a bad wound.
And it weighs you down.
Yeah, or not. In my case, I wasn't even aware that I had it. I didn't feel weighed down by it, but unconsciously it kept me from visiting those young women who had lost babies. So it can be very unconscious, and it's there. Yeah.
I know you've worked with so many people over the years, Trudy, and we love finding out from people, what do you think it is that stops people from taking risks, even though that step could be incredibly wonderful and it would bring to fruition a vision for themselves or for the world? What stops people?
Fear stops people. I'm sure you know that.
Yeah, but so you had some fear too around your risks, and then something compelled you to do it.
I don't know. I've been compelled. That's all I can say. And I'm not very fearful about the sort of things most people are fearful about. But I see people hold themselves back from doing things that they really want to do sometimes even, and that feel sort of risky to them because they're just afraid of what other people will think, afraid of, I don't know, I underline it all. I think maybe they're afraid of dying and that it's going to really be totally devastating.
I think that's where the fear of aging comes in, right?
For sure, that's why people are afraid of aging.
That leads to death.
Because
Or it
somehow
might
they
be the
think,
disability too. That's
Yeah.
my
And
that's my
disability.
fear. I have a fear of being disabled. I don't have a fear of dying, actually.
Yeah, many people have said that to me too. I'm not afraid of dying, but I don't want to be in a nursing home. I don't want to be in pain. I don't want this. Because in our culture now we have all these images of all these scary things. Not very many images out there of good deaths.
Trudy's documentary, Speaking of Dying, captured all kinds of conversations like these.
That's another reason I made the film, because I wanted people to see that they can, if you can envision a good death for yourself or a good ending of not being disabled, or if you're going to envision being disabled, then envision doing it with lots of support and
grace.
Grace and
yeah.
courage and joy.
Yeah, and I know, I'm blessed. I know a lot of older people in their 80s and 90s who are very joyful. So
In fact, joy in general increases with age.
absolutely,
It's one of the things that gets better with age.
absolutely.
So that was then, and this is now. And I asked Trudy one last question, which, is your typical sort of in the interview question.
Is there anything I haven't asked you that you wish that I had asked you? Because people will be listening to this and maybe they're hoping to get some.
This will not be appealing to many people, Deborah,
Why?
because it's just too far out and too esoteric and too non-specific, and I don't know how to do it any other way. So
Yeah. I think you underestimate people. And I think you underestimate my skill as an audio editor.
okay, yeah, you probably can make it into something worthwhile. I bet you can. Yeah, but
Or is there anything that you want to talk about that I haven't brought up?
no, I just wish deeply, deeply, deeply hope, wish, intend that people wouldn't be so afraid. I think fear is at the heart of everything negative. And I learned that from AIDS, but I've seen it play out over and over that fear is the enemy. Fear is fear gets in the way of the energy moving, so the energy can't flow. Fear is what polarizes people and what has caused all the problems in this country. People are afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Here's my final say for today. I hope Trudy was right and that I have managed to make something worthwhile. And I realize now that asking a death and dying expert to say wise and educational things about death and dying while she is in the middle of facing her own death is very much like asking an obstetrician to give a lecture on labor and delivery when she's in the midst of labor herself. I realize that now. I admit that Trudy never really answered what I'd set out to learn, what she had to say about dying while facing her own death, but I did learn something important about fear. Trudy was right about fear. It's polarizing and paralyzing. But if we can lean into it, we might discover amazing things about ourselves and others. We might discover energy flowing around and through us that is totally life-changing. I've seen this happen when people who are afraid of dying tiptoe into the conversational waters around death, and then before I know it, they are splashing around and then swimming laps. I believe that whatever situation you're in, if you focus on giving rather than getting, on giving rather than taking, things will turn out better for everyone. And to all my family and friends out there, if any of you find yourselves facing death, please know that I will never invite you on this podcast. If you want to be here, I welcome you, but you have to volunteer. Because I'd rather focus on what I can give you as your friend and not what you can give me as a podcast guest. You can hear the full episode of Trudy's interview on the art of risk, and there are lots of other really interesting interviews on there too. And you can find that podcast wherever you get your podcasts. I'll leave a link to The Art of Risk with me and Dr. Naseema Sefi in this episode transcript on the website, thefinalsaypodcast.com. So thanks for listening to The Final Say, Conversations with People Facing Death. I'm your host, Debra Jarvis, and I also edit and produce this podcast. Deepest gratitude to my friend Trudy James. Trudy died in 2024 on Sunday, October 20th. Thanks also to my dear friend Joanne Silberner, who gave me not only brilliant editorial suggestions, but much needed emotional support. And to you, listeners, please let me know what you thought of today's episode. You can hop over to the website, thefinalsaypodcast.com. And of course, I really appreciate you leaving me a review wherever you get your podcasts. And honestly, I don't know if reviews help get the word out, but I'll tell you, if you like this episode and you review it, it will make me feel so much better about effing up this interview. And thank you, as always, to Blue Dot Sessions for providing music. And may you find beauty and joy in your day.